So welcome to Independent Thinkers on Digital, a series which aims to gain insight through some incisive dialogue with some of the world's leading independent thinkers. I'm William Webb, I'm the CTO at Access Partnership, and my guest today is Dean Bubley. Dean is very well known to many of you, I'm sure, the founder of Disruptive Analysis. In his own words, he's an outspoken analyst and futurist with 25 years experience specialising in mobile and telecoms fields, but with an eye on the broader technological, governmental and societal contexts. And given that he's a futurist and I dabble in that area too, I thought we would spend today talking about the future. And like Dean, I find it very difficult to talk about 1 year out or 2 years out. Not that much changes actually generally in such a short space of time. Better I find it to look a bit further out when you can get the bigger changes, you can see some of these trends start to unravel over time. So I've asked Dean to look about 10 years out, so roughly to 2033. I mean, not precisely, but in that kind of time scale. And what we're going to do between us is we're both going to throw out ideas, some of which we like, some of which we dislike, but ideas that are currently being talked about as kind of some of the things of the future. And we'll see where we agree and we'll see where we disagree. And hopefully that'll be an interesting guide to what might happen over the next 10 years. So, Dean, I'm going to kick us off, and I'm going to kick us off with Internet of Things. And I'm doing that. I sometimes wonder whether I've got too much of an emotional attachment to Internet of Things because I co-founded a company in that space a long time ago. I kind of believed in it big time. And of course, it's broadly disappointed over the years. I mean, it's happening, but it's nothing like it was intended to. And when I look back, the big promise was back in 2010, 2011, when there was this number of 50 billion devices branded around by Cisco, by Ericsson. And that was kind of, where we were going to get to by about 2020, which of course we didn't. We got to about 8 billion, and that's counting the most optimistic way, including all the indoor devices and the smart speakers and those kind of things. But I don't know. I'd like to think that maybe by 2033 we will get to the 50 billion. And to put that into context, that's about 10 devices for each person with a smartphone. And that kind of connects a lot of things, not everything, but a lot of things. And I'm sort of optimistic somehow we'll get there, but I think it'll be mostly Wi-Fi and similar types of things. It's not going to be 5G, massive machine connectivity particularly. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think 50 billion, because counting it is an art as much as a science. I mean, is a car one device or 100 with all the sensors in it? Or a machine in a factory? It's like a cluster of moving parts, each with a sensor and any number of functions. So I think you can certainly concoct 50 billion. And I think that the interesting thing for me is that IoT, well, it was never an internet. It's a
correct.
collection of separate use cases. It's consumer, home IoT, it's wearables, it's industrial IoT, it's vehicles, it's smart agriculture, a whole bunch of stuff like that. Yeah, and there's no reason why a moisture sensor in a field is going to talk to my smart curtains.
Yeah, it's machine to machine. It was the old term, and that's probably better than IoT, but not so sexy.
Yeah. So I think there's a bit of accounting fiddling going on. We can probably come up with 50 billion. I remember seeing some numbers that went to trillions, which I think
I do remember that. IBM, I think, were the worst in that respect. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're kind of sort of positive, but with caveats around what does it really mean and what are the numbers?
That's an extra 10 years of exponential growth.
Yeah. Okay, what's your first one, Dean?
I'm on a completely different side of things. I'm going to talk about infrastructure and network sharing, whether that's for what are called neutral host mobile networks or open access fiber networks. I think that whether it's on economic grounds, competition grounds, just sort of reachability, or energy efficiency and resource efficiency, I think we're going to see more shared infrastructure. Not everywhere, not for everything, but I think it's going to become a lot more important in 10 years' time.
So, yeah, I absolutely buy that. So I've been, in the last year, I've been doing a bit of work for the Malaysian 5G shared network, which has got its own political problems writ large. But actually, once you dig into it, the logic for it is actually quite compelling. It's the challenges. And I think this will be the challenge everywhere. How do you get to there from here in any sensible manner? And my take is you do it gradually. So in the UK, we've got the shared rural network. So we've already got a shared network at the far edge. And I absolutely buy into your point that you could end up with a shared neutral host network in cities, in buildings, that kind of thing. And so you end up you end up building out shared networks from both extremes, from the most rural and the most urban, and then maybe you meet in the middle somewhere in 10 or 20 years' time.
And I think the other thing is that you'll have lots of different sharing mechanisms. And I think one of the things is there's a lot of debate about, is it going to be shared spectrum? Is it going to be shared RAN? Is it going to be shared fiber, backhaul, front haul, open RAN? The answer is all of the above, and lots of layers in between. And I think that there's no silver bullet on that, and we have to work to expect that there's going to be factors based on the economics, on the local regulatory, the history, and the desire for differentiation from all the tenants as well. And I'd also say, as well as wireless, it's going to be in the fixed domain. You've got a number of countries which have open access fibre, where you can essentially have any number of retail ISPs using the fibre infrastructure. It could be deployed by one wholesaler, by a city authority, by startups, by altnets. I think that the open access fibre is really important too. Yeah,
I absolutely agree with that. Okay, here's one I don't think is going to happen, and I'm going to throw in autonomous cars. And that might seem like a strange thing to throw into a predominantly telecoms discussion, but of course, part of the rationale for 5G was that it was required for autonomous cars, which it isn't anyway. But even if it were, I just can't see 10 years from now that we'll have any real autonomous cars, any cars without steering wheels. I can imagine that we've got cars that are pretty good at lane maintenance on motorways and dual carriageways, and certain routes on certain situations can pretty much take over, but nothing like full autonomy in 10 years.
I think you'll get full autonomy or robotaxis in certain limited contexts. So I can imagine a closed community, retirement village or something like that with robot taxis. You might have autonomous snow plows, construction machinery, this sort of thing in some places. You already do get for mining trucks with a fixed route around the quarry, but that's where you've got constraints. And I also think there's a separate category here of remotely driven vehicles or remote backup driver. Yeah. Ironically, that I think is more of a 5G use case than full autonomy.
Yeah, I agree. And do you think that's mostly for things like mines and that kind of thing, or do you think that's more?
I think some of it is going to be industrial vehicles. I mean, the snowplow example. If you can have depots around a northern country, and you sit in your home and you remotely pilot the snowplow, it's not like it's going to collide with anything else because it's thick snow on the road. So, that I can imagine. Yeah. And I also think possibly we get to robo-taxis which are autonomous on the highway and then remote drive for the last 5 kilometers or whatever. That's what you through a busy city centre. Yeah, you need to have good immersive connectivity, and that's going to be quite uplink heavy as well.
Yeah, interesting thought. I hadn't thought of the wider context of remote driving, but that does make sense. Okay, your turn.
Okay, I'll go for one which I am a bit sceptical of, which is mass market satellite direct-to-device for broadband. I'll buy the idea of the sort of the emergency text message where you're up a mountain or on a boat or something like that. Maybe thin amount of data. I just don't buy the idea that you're going to have multi-megabit speeds to multi-millions of users in any one geographic area via satellite direct to a phone.
Yeah, I think I would be with you on that one. There's actually an interesting article on that in the FT today as well, although more about the economics than the technology. But we've already seen with the iPhone how hard it is to do anything. And clearly, if Apple were able to do a lot more, they would have done. And what they've done is laudable, but it's a very minimal service. And the thought that could suddenly leap to something that is 100 times better in a short space of time is very hard to imagine, because there's a lot of laws of physics at play here. It's not something that a bit of invention will come up with a wonderful answer.
It's both laws of physics and also energy consumption. I mean, if you're indoors with your phone, are you really going to get 100 megabits a second uplink to something 300 kilometers away? Yeah, I'm really doubtful of that. Yeah, and there's a question of what size there's like these massive satellite that AST is trying to put up there. Yeah, there's some doubts as to sort of whether that's acceptable to have that surface area multiplied by however many hundreds or thousands of them you need in orbit without creating risks.
And the business case for doing large numbers also seems really tough to me. I can imagine you might get a bit of subsidy from governments for remote rural coverage or something, but this is not anything like the amount of money that you plan to a cellular network.
No, again, it's a bit like 5G, where one of the leading things has been fixed wireless access. I mean, satellite wireless access for remote areas, yeah, sure. I mean, Starlink's already proving the value of that, but that sort of millions or tens of millions is not hundreds of millions or billions of endpoints.
Yeah, good stuff. Okay, I'm going to bring us to Wi-Fi, which is also another one of those that I've long had hopes for that have somewhat been dashed. Well, I mean, not so. I mean, Wi-Fi is fabulously good. I've long hoped that we would overcome the password-ish problem that you turn up at the hotel or whatever, and you have to go through that whole login process. And of course, there's been so many initiatives over the years, Hotspot 2.0 and lots of other things, but none of them seem to have stuck sufficiently that you can actually access any Wi-Fi hotspot anywhere through a sort of automated process. And I just really hope in the next 10 years that gets solved. I kind of like to believe that it would.
I think open roaming is better than most because as a sort of federation model, because it's got more flexibility. So it might be, rather than the sort of Hotspot 2, which is very much mobile operator focused. You have Wi-Fi affinity with actually your fixed operator more than your mobile operator, or your device vendor, or your employer, or your educational establishment, or possibly a brand. So if I go to the airport, I would like to automatically connect to the Wi-Fi with my British Airways identifier, not my mobile phone number, which firstly, it doesn't work on my laptop, and secondly, it's not my mental connection with Wi-Fi. Yeah. I think we're getting closer to that, but it's going to come along in fits and starts, and fundamentally, Wi-Fi is in a lot of cases it's private. I can't expect to walk into a factory and get on the same Wi-Fi as the robots.
Yeah, that's a fair one. I've long thought there's some great things that could be done, like EduRoam, the university's open network, could be opened up to everyone. And that could be extended to all government buildings and all quasi-government buildings and all health centres and everything, so that every citizen could automatically log on to all of that stuff.
Well, I mean, EduRoam is fundamentally similar to the open roaming. It's like taking that principle so that you could have federation between, your health service and the rail company and your bank and your favourite airline and your favourite football club and your hotel chain of choice. Yeah, but I think you'll find there's going to be different sort of peering. So it might be that Marriott and American Airlines do a deal, or Barclays Bank's branches and the NHS, or whatever it happens to be.
Good stuff. Okay, look forward to that. Your turn.
Okay. I am going to go for 6G being energy efficient by design and being cautiously positive about that. And actually not this sort of more, bits per joule or whatever metric, but actually lower energy. Yeah, absolutely. And other things, this is perhaps over optimistic. I'd love to see an energy estimation function, in the same way you have all the other core network functions in 5G. So that at the very least, when you set a session up, you've got some rough idea of the implied energy impact of that.
And I would love that too. And like you, I look at the claims around 5G and find them very disingenuous. It's lower energy per bit. Well, yes, and a long haul flight is lower CO2 emissions per mile than a short haul, but it doesn't mean we should all start flying long haul rather than short haul. So I definitely think that's right. And I think there's two drivers for that. One, of course, is the desire to be sustainable, but the other is just the cost of energy now for mobile operators is so significant. It's actually worth their while having a system that's lower energy. What I'm less sure about is whether everyone's willing to make the trade-offs that are really needed to do that. And we were talking about that earlier on, the effectively dropping stuff off to Wi-Fi or very small cells and sharing a lot more on the network side would be the obvious way to do that. And would make for some good networks, but it's a long way away from the current model of the mobile infrastructure manufacturers and operators.
Yeah, and you have to be very careful about the carbon accounting. And I'm already seeing some, let's be generous, creative approaches. So there seems to be an interesting question of when an operator spins off its towers, does that transfer its CO2 from what's called scope 1 and 2 to scope 3, which often comes, which is like this supply chain, and often comes with a later date for hitting net zero. So to me, it looks like off-balance sheet accounting of CO2.
Yes. Yeah. I'm sure there'll be plenty of that. Okay. Here's one where I think we might disagree, or at least we might need to talk a bit more about terminology, and that's edge. So when edge was first talked about, particularly in the cellular context, the impression kind of was that there would be computing nodes in every base station. The edge was right at the very, very edge. And that struck me as nuts, frankly, particularly when many base stations are trying to move most of their computing back into the network anyway with distributed and radio systems and so on. But the whole rationale doing it doesn't make that much sense either, because it's a latency reduction tool, but light travels 300 kilometers in 1 millisecond. So you can go 50 kilometers back from the base station without any really detrimental effect. So I can't see why you'd have edge right at the edge. I can see the rationale for an edge in every major city or even minor cities in the country, because that's a sensible place to put computing resources. But that's about as far as I go with edge.
I would say that at one level I agree. I think that the first thing is, I think the edge has relatively little to do with mobile networks. I mean, frankly, if you're not using fixed edge computing, then mobile edge computing is largely irrelevant, because almost all of the latency sensitive applications are in data centers or enterprise facilities connected with fiber, or even at home. With what we're doing now, frankly, I'm connected with fixed connection. So if there's no fixed edge, the mobile edge is even smaller. But what I would say is that it's not all just about latency. And I think it's also about autonomy and control. And so I think that there's a lot of, if you like, campus edge, or essentially the computer room version 2. So if you've got a factory or a mine or something like that, firstly, your backhaul is questionable sometimes. And secondly, you want your data on your server, even if it's running on an Amazon stack, in your secure container full of servers in the car park. On the basement. So I think that there's going to be the sort of on-prem edge. I think the metro edge, as you were talking about, and there's a little bit of a difference here as well between markets like the UK, where it's sort of 600 kilometres from end to end, versus America or China or Australia, where your 50 kilometres doesn't get you very far.
Yeah, you could be 3,000 kilometres in the US if you need to go from coast to coast.
Particularly if your data centre's in Virginia. Then you really don't know. And also, bear in mind that often fibre doesn't take a direct line of sight. You can do that on wireless, but particularly if you're going sub-oceanic, fibre has to go around mountains and trenches and all the rest of it. It's not as linear as you think, and you've got various things that are boxes in between to refresh the signal. So it's not quite like that. Yeah,
but I certainly agree with you. Well, I agree with pretty much all that. And the premise is a good point, that in that case, it's a completely different rationale for doing it. And it makes perfectly good sense to have your own computing resources on your own premises for a whole load of very good reasons.
Yeah, there are some exceptions to this. So for example, on mobile, Rakuten, and their architecture has private cloud by edge. I think they do have it nearly every, if not every base station, then every cluster of them. But that's they've got very, very low footprint, low energy, standardized servers, and that's not running customer compute tasks. It's their own in-house requirements for the radio.
Okay, so I think we're more agreement than I thought you might be there. So your turn to throw out one.
The next one, which I think which allies to this, which is, I think rather than edge compute, I think edge interconnects is more important. And actually, the thing is that compute very rarely has an application running as a monolith on one server. You've got, if you look at a web page, there's probably 100 components. You've got the analytics, the advertising, the embedded video, all the rest of it. And the same for an enterprise application. It comes in lots of component parts, often delivered from different servers, from different clouds. People want multi-cloud, all the rest of it. And so actually what we really need is a much more dense network of interconnect points. And I'm starting to see movement, whether it's around various local terms like local breakout or local points of presence for internet exchanges, various sort of models for that. And I think that slowly that dam is breaking, and I think we'll have a much more interconnected edge if you look at 10 years.
Yeah, I talked to an investment company actually just last week who mentioned that was starting to bubble and was on their horizon, and they were seeing lots of lots of kind of small scale but interesting ways to do that they were investing in because they thought it made sense, even from a just purely financial sort of metric, that you can effectively avoid paying certain amounts of traffic fees by doing that. So it was actually a sensible thing to do. So I can kind of see that, but is that a sort of slow, gradual growth kind of thing, or is that where a big giant leaps in and does it and makes it happen suddenly for a whole country?
I mean, you've got the big data center companies that have been talking about this for a long time, the sort of Equinixes of this world that are getting progressively more granular. And you've got people like Vapor who are pushing this as an idea as well. So I think we're getting there, but I think there's still a bit of institutional blockage in the mobile networks in particular, who want to funnel everything back through their core network and often only have a handful of breakout points to the internet. And to some extent that you end up getting politicization around this whole issue of content streaming and transit and everything else. And that it gets boiled into this sort of cost of sort of network delivery. Yeah.
And I can imagine there might be a few things around security issues and wiretapping or the modern equivalent and all those other kind of things that people at least hold up as a reason for not doing it.
But I mean, to some extent for enterprise and for cloud applications, people will talk about hybrid multi-cloud. Right? You go out to the mobile industry, and that phrase crops up a lot. But it hasn't quite got into the telecom mindset that everything is hybrid multi-cloud. And I think it might only be when they're running their own core networks and their own BSS OSS stacks as hybrid multi-cloud, they suddenly realise that sort of interconnected mesh is what's essential.
Yeah. Okay. Right, I'm going to take us to two combined topics, one of which I think is good and one is bad, and that's AR and VR. I mean, good and bad is a bit too black and white, but I've long thought that there's lots of potential for AR, particularly AR that's kind of handset-based, the classic Pokemon Go kind of stuff, and then a lot more than that. You hold your handset up, the camera gives you a view on the world, you superimpose a chair from IKEA on your living room or whatever. And potentially AR glasses, although I've always thought that's a big technological ask to actually achieve something that you'd want to wear outdoors that's light enough to do so, and yet has all the ability to deliver all that functionality. But apparently Apple are about to launch something sometime soon, so I'll hold my breath on that and wait and see what happens. So I'm kind of moderately optimistic about most of the AR stuff, but VR, I mean, for niche things, sure, absolutely. Great for training, great for taking people into environments that are unsafe, all those other kind of things. But as a mass market proposition, I'm not so sure. And I saw, and I'm sure you did, that the VR headset sales last year were down 20% on the year before, which is not indicative of a market that's about to suddenly transform itself.
Yeah, I think VR is it's sort of gaming and training and simulation. I think makes a lot of sense. AR, I'm cautiously positive about for different things. I can imagine if you're a field worker or industrial setting, it's like tighten this bolt to 30 degrees or something like that. That may or sort of don't dig here because there's a cable underneath. And I can certainly see that type of application, as well as sort of head-up displays in vehicles, perhaps. So I think that type of thing. Consumer, there's some, there's some games. There's I can see a virtual art display on the wall next to me.
Yeah.
Do I think we're going to be walking around immersed in all of this? Probably not.
No.
Maybe I'm too old for it, but I just it's not something I feel an urgent need for.
No, I can imagine you're sort of walking along thinking, what a lovely sunset, and suddenly a big thing pops up and says, "That's the sun." Well, I knew that.
Exactly. A prompt or sort of, did you mean? Did you mean bum? Here's the cake shop. You're like, no. I think it's actually amusing that we all thought this was going to be a big theme over the last few months at conferences, and it's basically got superseded by ChatGPT and generative AI.
Yeah.
Which is, ironically, the bandwidth requirements are very limited for certainly the current text-based version. It's sort of all about generating slabs of text and the occasional image, and I'm sure that will evolve more. But we seem to be all much more excited about 3 paragraphs of text than they are about the world at the moment.
It's that classic quote that we wanted flying cars and got 160 characters that Peter Thiel came up with. I was actually going to throw ChatGPT at the end, but since we've come across it, that's one I am very uncertain about at the moment. I can't see it revolutionising the world, but it's bloody useful.
So we're recording this the day that GPT-4 has been released, and some of the examples I saw online this morning, I was like, okay, yeah, and that's where we've come in a few months from the last. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, I think this has got a good 50% plus chance of having really interesting ramifications. Perhaps not the sort of change the world in the way the internet did, but there's a non-zero probability of that. Actually, and I think that it also has a lot of implications for the types of work that you and I do. I mean, if I write a report, there's always like a sort of introduction section which is tedious to write, but everyone expects it to be there. It doesn't have anything new on it. It sets the scene. And frankly, if I could say, ChatGPT, can you write a page of introduction for XYZ report? And I can then get on with writing the interesting stuff afterwards, I'd be like, yeah, I'll do that.
So I don't know how much of this I should admit, but I will anyway. I mean, proposal writing, you and I do a lot of it, and some of that's quite tedious because it's kind of a lot of boilerplate stuff. The last proposal I wrote, I got ChatGPT to write about half of it. And I went in and edited what it came up with, but actually I didn't need to do a lot. So the kind of the background stuff, it does seem pretty good at.
But I see this as a great example. Everyone's been talking about this sort of centaur of robot versus with human or AI and human. And for that sort of thing, is if I can outsource the dull bits to a robot, then why not?
Sounds good.
Okay. Obviously, I'm a bit more threatened if it does the interesting bits and comes up with better ideas than I do. But that's a different story. One of the reasons I like being contrarian is that it's very difficult for a machine learning test set to include contrarian opinions. Well, actually, GPT, it's like, what do you think of 5G? And I said, what do you think a contrarian would say? And it had gone out and learned some of the counterpoints.
Yeah, generally though, it just says on the one hand, on the other hand, which is balanced, but not very useful. Okay, I think we've got time for one more each. So if there's one you particularly want to pick to finish off your set with, go for it.
All right, I'm going to be a skeptic of the sort of DY, blockchain, cryptocurrency, etc. I mean, decentralized networks, I've got time for. FON, Wi-Fi network in 2006 was decentralized. Arguably, the internet itself is decentralized.
Yeah.
But I'm not paying funny money tokens of varying values for using your Wi-Fi or private 4G, 5G of unknown provenance and security.
I absolutely agree. And happily it seems to have died down a bit. But, for example, in the last few years, there's been, let's have shared spectrum databases running on blockchain. Why? Well, because blockchain's trendy and fun and we can decentralize it. But why would you want to decentralize it? What's the advantage? Well, we're not sure, but and I think there's been a lot of this kind of, we'll just grab it because it looks trendy without really understanding what it's good and bad for.
I've got more sympathy for blockchain as the sort of ledger database type function, particularly with multi-access, with multiple parties, than I do for as a basis for transactions. Because sort of ledgers and databases tend to have longevity, and it's like, right, I need to have a record that is written, that is non-repudiable, that 97 different stakeholders can get access to. And I suspect, I think when talking about access, I think the cat is about to get access to this room. But
that's all right. We can have the cat on the podcast. That adds to the interest. Okay.
But,
so last one from me. Another sort of hope over common sense, but I've always thought that the biggest single thing that wireless could do that would be transformational now to us, given that it's already transformed most things, is to transform healthcare. I mean, healthcare basically exists for the most part in a world of about 20 or 30 years ago, where surgeons send letters to doctors and people actually answer telephones and things like that. And you just kind of feel this could be dramatically enhanced. And we got a little bit of a glimpse during COVID that, yes, that was actually possible. And then it hasn't really moved that much. But this whole world of it being able to people live in their homes longer because they've got all sorts of sensors that monitor them, remind them what they do, where they are, where they're going. people, all that kind of thing feels like it's got a lot that it could add. And yet, of course, the blockers are just enormous. The problems of the bureaucracy and the quite rightly risk-averse approach and so on are so great that making any kind of progress is difficult. But equally, healthcare systems are absolutely creaking at the knees at the moment, and maybe, just maybe, that will allow us to try out new stuff that we wouldn't have tried before. So I'm kind of slightly optimistic, as I have been for a long time, that healthcare 10 years from now will have a lot more IT enablement.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think it's going to be patchy. Yeah, and I'm like speaking from personal experience of some relatives at the moment, and decent Wi-Fi in hospitals for sure. That's already there.
Yeah.
But actually connecting, whether it's even basic things like wheelchairs, or there's some asset management for high-end value devices, but there's remarkably little. And I think it's going to be difficult for people who are financing healthcare, because you've got so many calls on your budget, not least of which is people.
Yeah.
Like, if you a good example is, do you hire another physiotherapist for your, or do you have smarter devices for the 3 physiotherapists you've got in your practice? Yeah, and that's not an easy call. And I think that there's some good stuff around diagnostics. Some of the data that comes out of an Apple Watch is really good, on things like monitoring heart rate and you've got ECG function and things like that. But I think that it's going to be difficult to get that done equitably, or it's also going to be difficult to get that into medical systems where they're very suspicious of any data that they haven't generated themselves.
Yeah, I think that I absolutely agree with that. And it's a shame, because there's so much that could be done. And, for sure there'll be some issues that crop up, but probably the benefits will outweigh the issues 100-fold. But the problem is the issues make the headline newspaper and cause us to creep to a halt, and that's so often the case.
We haven't mentioned it, but I'll throw it in here. Hospitals as a potential vertical for private networks, and that's an interesting one. Private networks generally. I think healthcare is one of many different verticals where having a cellular network as well as Wi-Fi may be valuable.
Yeah, absolutely, because of the reliability it brings, essentially the backup, and all those kind of things.
And sort of outdoor areas and things like that. If you've got a rehabilitating patient who goes out in a wheelchair around the gardens, probably not going to be on Wi-Fi, but he may well have a decent cellular connection. Great.
Well, that pretty much brings us to the end. And actually, we disagreed less than I thought we would. I mean, we generally agreed, so I didn't expect a kind of an out-and-out kind of argument, but I didn't think we'd be quite so much aligned. So you've heard it now. The two of the top futurologists have called it for the next 10 years, and placed your bets. Dean, thank you ever so much. It's been great fun.
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks, really appreciate it.